My name is Rebecca Williams. I am 41 years old. I am a brigadier general in the United States Army. But on the day of my father's funeral, none of that mattered to the people who should have known me best. To them, I was still the disappointment, the black sheep, the daughter who had chosen the wrong path and brought shame to the family name. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. I stood at the back of St. Matthew's Lutheran Church in Richmond, Virginia, watching through the heavy oak doors as my stepmother directed the ushers with sharp gestures and whispered commands. The September morning was crisp, leaves beginning to turn amber and gold. But inside that sanctuary, the air felt thick with decades of unspoken resentment. They had made it clear I wasn't welcome at the front. No reserved seating for me, no place among the family in the first 3 rows. My half-brother Marcus sat in the front pew, his wife beside him, their 2 children dressed in perfectly pressed black clothes. My stepmother Patricia held court next to them, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, accepting condolences from a steady stream of visitors who approached with somber faces and gentle touches. I remained standing at the back, my dress uniform immaculate, my posture straight despite the weight pressing down on my chest. The service dress blues felt heavier than usual, not from the fabric, but from the significance of wearing them in a place where they represented everything. My family had spent 23 years trying to erase about me. The last time I had spoken to my father was 8 months ago, a brief phone call on his 72nd birthday. He had sounded tired, distant, his voice carrying that same polite coolness it had held for decades. We talked about the weather, about my current assignment at Fort Bragg, about nothing that mattered. When I asked about his health, he brushed off my concerns with practiced efficiency. When I mentioned visiting for the holidays, he made vague noises about how busy everyone would be. The conversation lasted exactly 7 minutes. I know because I timed it, the way I had timed every interaction with him since I was 19 years old, and made the decision that would define the rest of our relationship. The decision to serve my country instead of serving his expectations. Now he was gone, and the finality of it pressed against my ribs like a physical weight. There would be no more stilted phone calls, no more careful birthday cards with generic messages, no more hope that someday we might bridge the canyon that had opened between us the day I chose the military over the family business. The church filled slowly around me. I recognized some faces from childhood. Neighbors, family friends, business associates of my father's construction company. None of them approached me. Some offered polite nods when our eyes met, but most looked away quickly, as if acknowledging my presence might somehow align them with whatever transgression I represented in the family narrative. Patricia had been particularly thorough in her orchestration of my exclusion. When the funeral director had called to discuss arrangements, he mentioned that the family had specifically requested that military honors be kept to a minimum. A simple service, he had been told. Nothing too elaborate. What he didn't say, but what I understood perfectly, was that they wanted nothing that might draw attention to my career, nothing that might force them to acknowledge what I had become. I watched my father's casket at the front of the church, draped in a simple white cloth, surrounded by arrangements of white lilies and yellow roses. He had been a complicated man. My father, brilliant in business, generous with his community, but rigid in his expectations and unforgiving when those expectations weren't met. He had built Williams Construction from a single truck and a handful of tools into one of the largest contracting firms in Central Virginia. He had employed hundreds of people, built schools and hospitals and affordable housing. He had been respected, even admired, but he had never forgiven me for walking away from it all. The morning I graduated from West Point, 23 years ago, he sat in the audience with his arms crossed and his jaw set in a line I recognized from childhood. When I crossed the stage to receive my commission, when I raised my right hand to take the oath, when I threw my cap into the air with my classmates, he remained seated, stone-faced, unmoved. The drive home afterward had been silent. Patricia made small talk about the weather and the campus architecture, but my father stared out the window as the Hudson River Valley rolled past. When we reached the house, he went directly to his study and closed the door. I didn't see him again until dinner, where he spoke to everyone at the table except me, That pattern continued for years. I was present but not acknowledged, included in family gatherings but treated like a polite stranger. My achievements in the military were never mentioned, never celebrated, never even recognized. When I received my Bronze Star for service in Iraq, I sent him a copy of the citation. He never responded. When I was promoted to colonel, I called to share the news. He handed the phone to Patricia after 30 seconds. Standing in that church, surrounded by the whispered conversations of mourners who barely knew I existed, I felt the familiar ache that had lived in my chest for over 2 decades. The ache of being invisible to the person whose approval had once meant everything to me. The ache of carrying a name that had opened doors for everyone in my family except me. The organ began to play, a low, mournful melody that filled the vaulted ceiling and settled into the wooden pews like dust. The congregation rose, hymnals rustling, voices joining in harmony. I remained standing at the back, my hands clasped behind me, watching as my stepmother leaned into Marcus's shoulder with practiced grief. They had written me out of this story years ago. In their version, Thomas Williams had one son, Marcus, who had taken over the family business and carried on the family legacy. He had one wife, Patricia, who had stood by his side through 40 years of marriage and community involvement. He had 2 grandchildren who would inherit his name and his values. In their version, I didn't exist. I was the mistake, the detour, the daughter who had chosen duty over family and honor over home. I was the one who had broken his heart by walking away from everything he had built. But I knew something they didn't. I knew who I really was, what I had accomplished, and what was about to happen in the next few minutes that would shatter their carefully constructed narrative forever. The chaplain stepped to the podium, his uniform crisp and his bearing steady. He was older, maybe 60, with silver hair and kind eyes that had seen too many funerals, too many families torn apart by grief and old wounds. He cleared his throat gently, and the congregation settled into attentive silence. He began to speak about my father's life, his contributions to the community, his dedication to his family and his business. Standard words, appropriate words, the kind of eulogy that honored a life well lived without diving too deep into the complexities that made every human story unique. But then something shifted in his voice. He paused, looked down at his notes, and when he raised his eyes again, they found mine across the crowded sanctuary. And I knew, at that moment, I knew that everything was about to change. I wasn't always the outsider in my own family. There was a time, before Patricia, before Marcus, when it was just my father and me against the world. My mother died when I was 6 years old, a sudden heart defect that the doctors said no one could have predicted. For 3 years after that, my father and I existed in a bubble of shared grief and quiet understanding. He would wake me up on Saturday mornings, and we'd drive to construction sites together. I'd sit in the passenger seat of his old Ford pickup, my small hands wrapped around a thermos of hot chocolate, watching the sun rise over half-built houses and empty lots that would soon become schools or community centers. He'd walk me through the sites, explaining how foundations were laid, how walls were framed, how something solid and lasting could be built from nothing but plans and determination. The years when he called me his little engineer, when he bought me a pink hard hat and let me carry a clipboard around the job sites. The years when he taught me to read blueprints and showed me how to use a level, and told me stories about his own father who had been a carpenter during the Depression. I remember one morning, I must have been 8, standing next to him as he reviewed plans with his foreman. The project was a new elementary school, and I was fascinated by the complexity of it all. The electrical systems, the plumbing, the careful calculations that ensured the building would stand for decades. "Daddy," I asked, tugging on his jacket, "could I build something like this someday?" He knelt down to my level, his calloused hands resting on my shoulders. "Sweetheart," he said, his voice serious, "you could build something even better. You've got the mind for it, and the heart." That memory became a cornerstone for me, something I carried through all the years that followed. The belief that I could build something lasting, something that mattered. I just didn't know then that what I would build wouldn't be made of steel and concrete. Everything changed when I was 9 and my father married Patricia. She wasn't cruel exactly, she was just Where my mother had been warm and spontaneous, Patricia was controlled and calculating. Where my mother had encouraged my curiosity about my father's work, Patricia steered conversations toward more appropriate topics for young ladies. The changes started small. The Saturday morning construction site visits became less frequent, then stopped altogether. My pink hard hat disappeared from the front hall closet. When I asked about it, Patricia explained gently that it was time for me to develop other interests, more suitable interests. She enrolled me in piano lessons and ballet classes. She bought me dresses in soft pastels and showed me how to sit with my ankles crossed and my hands folded. She wasn't unkind about it, but she was relentless. Every rough edge of my personality was smoothed away. Every interest that didn't align with her vision of proper femininity was quietly discouraged. When Marcus was born 2 years later, the shift became complete. He was the miracle baby, the son my father had always wanted, the heir to the Williams legacy. Patricia made sure of that narrative, and my father, exhausted from grief and grateful for a second chance at happiness, went along with it. I watched from the sidelines as my father taught Marcus the same things he had once taught me: the blueprints, the tools, the stories about building something from nothing. But now I was expected to stay inside with Patricia, learning to arrange flowers and plan dinner parties and speak in soft, measured tones that were never challenged or questioned. The worst part wasn't the exclusion. It was the way my father seemed to forget who I had been before Patricia reshaped me. When I tried to join their conversations about business, he would smile and pat my head and suggest I go help Patricia in the kitchen. When I asked questions about a new project, he would give me simplified answers, the kind you give to someone who couldn't possibly understand the real complexity. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. School became my refuge. I excelled in mathematics and science, subjects that felt clean and logical in a way my home life no longer did. My teachers encouraged me, pushed me, and saw potential that my family seemed determined to ignore. Mrs. Henderson, my 5th grade math teacher, was the first person to suggest I might be interested in engineering. "You have a natural aptitude for spatial reasoning," she told me after I completed a particularly challenging geometry problem. "Have you ever thought about what you might want to study in college?" College felt like a distant dream. In Patricia's world, girls went to college to meet suitable husbands, not to pursue careers. But Mrs. Henderson planted a seed that took root in a way Patricia's lessons never had. By the time I reached high school, the division in our family was clear and permanent. Marcus was the golden child, the one who would inherit everything. I was the decoration, the well-mannered daughter who would eventually marry well and reflect positively on the family name. But I had other plans. I threw myself into academics with an intensity that worried my teachers and frustrated my parents. I joined the debate team, the math club, and the science olympiad. I studied military history and read biographies of generals and engineers. I learned about West Point, about the opportunities available to women in the military, about the possibility of building a life based on merit rather than expectations. The first time I mentioned my interest in the military academy, Patricia literally laughed. We were sitting around the dinner table, Marcus chattering about his latest Little League game, when I brought up a documentary I'd seen about women at West Point. "That's nice, dear," Patricia said, cutting her chicken into precise, small pieces. "But you know that's not really for girls like you." "What do you mean, girls like me?" I asked. "Well-bred girls," she said, as if it were obvious. "Girls with opportunities. Girls who don't need to prove themselves by doing men's work." My father didn't disagree. He didn't say anything at all. He just focused on his dinner while Patricia explained, in her patient, condescending tone, why a military career would be a waste of my education and breeding. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling and made a promise to myself. I would prove them wrong. Not to win their approval, I was beginning to understand that would never come, but to prove to myself that I was capable of more than they imagined. I started preparing for the military academy entrance exams in secret. I borrowed books from the library, studied online, and reached out to recruiters who could provide guidance. My grades were already excellent, but I pushed them higher. I joined the track team to improve my physical fitness. I sought out leadership opportunities wherever I could find them. The hardest part was maintaining the facade at home. Patricia continued to plan my future around suitable marriages and charity work. She talked about cotillion and sorority rush and summer internships at fashion magazines. I nodded and smiled and played the part while every fiber of my being pulled towards something different. The day I received my appointment to West Point, I sat in my car in the school parking lot and cried, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of knowing that escape was possible. I had done it on my own, without their help or their approval or their understanding. I waited until dinner to tell them. Marcus was 14, then already talking about joining the family business after high school. Patricia was discussing plans for my debutante ball. My father was reviewing blueprints between bites. The way he always did. "I have some news," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. They looked up expectantly. Patricia smiled, probably thinking I was going to announce a boyfriend or a summer job at the country club. "I've been accepted to the United States Military Academy at West Point." The silence stretched like a taut wire. Patricia's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Marcus looked confused. My father set down his blueprints very carefully, his face unreadable. "You what?" Patricia asked, her voice higher than usual. "I'm going to West Point," I repeated. "I'll be studying engineering and military science. After graduation, I'll be commissioned as an officer in the United States Army." Patricia turned to my father, her eyes wide with something between shock and betrayal. "Thomas, surely you're not going to allow this." My father looked at me for a long moment, his gray eyes searching my face as if seeing me for the first time in years. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, measured. "When did you apply?" "Last year," I said. "I've been preparing for the entrance exams for 2 years." "Without telling us?" "I told you I was interested. You said it wasn't for girls like me." He flinched slightly at that, and for a moment I thought I saw something like regret flicker across his features, but then Patricia placed her hand on his arm, and the moment passed. "This is ridiculous," she said. "Rebecca, you're throwing away every advantage you've been given. Your father has built something magnificent here, something that could provide for you and your future family for generations. Why would you walk away from that to play soldier?" "I'm not playing anything," I said, my voice harder now. "This is my life, my choice." My father finally spoke, and when he did, his words cut deeper than Patricia's ever could. "I see I've failed as a father," he said quietly. "I thought I'd raised you to understand the value of family, of loyalty, of carrying on what previous generations have built. Apparently I was wrong." That night, I packed my bags and moved in with my best friend's family for the remainder of senior year. The die was cast, and there would be no going back. Graduation day at Riverside High School was supposed to be a celebration. The sun shone bright over the football stadium. Families filled the bleachers with flowers and cameras, and the air buzzed with excitement about futures stretching ahead like open roads. I sat with my classmates in the folding chairs on the field, my cap slightly askew, scanning the crowd for familiar faces. My best friend Sarah's parents were there, beaming and waving. They had become my surrogate family over the past few months, feeding me dinner every night and treating me like a daughter. Miss Chan had even helped me shop for a dress for the ceremony, insisting that every girl deserved to feel special on graduation day. But the seats where my real family should have been sitting remained empty. I had sent them an invitation. A formal, printed invitation with my name spelled out in elegant script, the same invitation every graduate received to mail to their loved ones. I had written a note on the back. Something simple and hopeful. "It would mean everything to have you there. Love, Rebecca." I never received a response. The principal called my name, and I walked across the stage to receive my diploma. I shook his hand, smiled for the photographer, and moved my tassel from right to left. In the audience, the Chen family cheered loudly enough for 10 people, but the absence of my father's voice, my stepmother's applause, even Marcus's teenage indifference, created a hollow space that no amount of celebration could fill. After the ceremony, while other families gathered for pictures and tearful hugs, I helped the Chains load their car with folding chairs and camera equipment. Sarah's mother squeezed my shoulder and told me how proud she was, how excited she was for my journey to West Point. Her kindness only made the ache sharper. That evening, while the rest of my graduating class celebrated at parties and all-night dinners, I drove to the construction site where my father was building a new medical complex. It was after 9 o'clock, but I knew he would still be there. He always worked late when something was bothering him, losing himself in the familiar rhythm of checking progress and solving problems. I found him in the trailer that served as the on-site office, hunched over blueprints under the harsh fluorescent lights. He looked older than his 55 years, his hair more gray than brown now, his shoulders carrying the weight of running a business and managing a family that seemed to be fracturing along lines he didn't understand. He looked up when I knocked, and for a moment, something like relief flickered across his face. Then he remembered himself, remembered the walls that had grown between us, and his expression became carefully neutral. "Rebecca," he said, not rising from his chair. "Congratulations on graduating." "Thank you." I stood in the doorway, suddenly unsure why I had come. What had I expected? An apology? An explanation? A last-minute change of heart? "I suppose you're all packed for New York," he said, returning his attention to the blueprints. "I leave next week for basic training preparation." I stepped into the trailer, closing the door behind me. "Dad, can we talk?" "Really talk?" He set down his pencil and leaned back in his chair, studying me with the same careful attention he gave to structural problems. "What's on your mind? I don't understand why you're so angry with me. I don't understand why choosing to serve my country is something to be ashamed of." His jaw tightened. "You think I'm ashamed of military service, aren't you?" He stood then, moving to the window that looked out over the construction site. In the distance, floodlights illuminated the skeleton of the building that would soon house an emergency room and surgical suites. "My father served in World War II, he said quietly, lost 3 fingers on his left hand in the Pacific, came home and built half the houses in this county with those 7 remaining fingers, and a determination I still don't fully understand." I waited, sensing that he had more to say. "Your grandfather never talked much about the war, but he talked constantly about what came after, about building something that would last, something that would provide for his family for generations. He started this company with nothing but a tool belt and a promise to my grandmother that he would never leave her wanting for anything." He turned from the window to face me. "I've spent 30 years expanding what he built, 30 years creating jobs for people in this community, building the infrastructure that makes life better for thousands of families, and now my daughter, my only child from my first marriage, wants to walk away from all of that to go play war games with a bunch of strangers." "Play war games?" The words came out sharper than I intended. "Dad, I'm not playing anything. I'm choosing to serve something bigger than myself. Something bigger than family." There it was. The heart of it. The accusation that had been building for months, maybe years. That my choice represented a betrayal, not just of his expectations, but of everything he and his father had worked to build. "Why can't both things matter?" I asked. "Why does serving my country mean I don't value what you've built?" "Because you can't do both," he said, his voice rising slightly. "You can't build something lasting if you're constantly moving around, constantly following orders from people who don't know you or care about you. You can't raise a family if you're deployed half the year. You can't be part of a community if you're never here to contribute to it." I felt something crystallize inside me then, a clarity that cut through months of confusion and hurt. "You're not angry that I'm leaving," I said. "You're angry that I'm choosing something you didn't choose for me." His face flushed. "I'm angry that you're throwing away every advantage you've been given. I'm angry that you're so determined to prove something to people who will never see you as more than a uniform. And what do you see me as?" The question hung in the air between us like a challenge. He opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again. In that moment of hesitation, I saw the truth he couldn't bring himself to say. He saw me as Patricia wanted him to see me. As the daughter who should have been content with the life they had planned for her. As the girl who should have been grateful for the opportunity to marry well and produce grandchildren who would carry on the family name. He had never seen me as the child who had once carried a clipboard on construction sites. He had never seen me as the teenager who excelled in mathematics and physics. He had never seen me as the teenager who excelled in mathematics and physics. He had never seen me as the young woman who was capable of making her own choices about her own life. I need you to understand something, I said. My voice steady despite the emotion churning in my chest. I'm not doing this to hurt you. I'm not doing this to reject what you've built. I'm doing this because it's who I am. Who you are is a Williams, he said. That name means something in this community. It stands for quality, for integrity, for keeping your word. Don't throw that away for some misguided notion of adventure. I'm not throwing it away. I'm carrying it with me. He shook his head, the gesture heavy with finality. If you walk out that door next week, if you choose them over us, then you're not carrying anything with you except your own selfishness. The words hit like a physical blow. I felt my breath catch, felt tears threaten at the corners of my eyes, but I also felt something else. The quiet strength that had carried me through 2 years of secret preparation, through months of living with the knowledge that my family would never understand my choice. Then I guess that's what I'll have to live with, I said. I turned to leave, but his voice stopped me at the door. Rebecca. I looked back, hoping against hope that he had found some way to bridge the gap between us. When you realize you've made a mistake, he said quietly, when you're ready to come home and be part of this family again, I'll be here. But I heard what he wasn't saying. I would be welcome back, only if I came back on his terms. Only if I abandoned everything I had worked for, and became the daughter he and Patricia wanted me to be. What if I don't realize I've made a mistake? I asked. What if this is exactly what I'm supposed to do with my life? His silence was answer enough. I left the trailer and drove straight to the Chen house, where Sarah was waiting for me with ice cream and tissues and the kind of unconditional support I had never experienced from my own family. We talked until dawn about fear and courage, and the terrifying beauty of choosing your own path. A week later, I boarded a plane to New York with a single suitcase and a heart full of determination. I didn't look back as the plane lifted off. Didn't wonder if my father might have come to see me off after all. I was 18 years old, and I was flying toward a future I would build with my own hands, brick by brick. Choice by choice, I was flying toward the person I was meant to become, not the person others wanted me to be. Behind me, I left a family that would rather lose a daughter than accept that she might have dreams of her own. Ahead of me lay 4 years at West Point, then a career in the United States Army, then whatever challenges and opportunities service would bring. I was ready for all of it. I had been preparing for this moment my entire life, even before I knew what I was preparing for. The plane banked east toward the sunrise, and I closed my eyes and felt, for the first time in years, like I was exactly where I belonged. West Point was nothing like the movies made it seem. The gray stone buildings and manicured grounds were beautiful, but the reality of cadet life was harder, more demanding, and more transformative than any Hollywood depiction could capture. From the moment I stepped off the bus during reception day, I knew I had entered a world that would either break me or forge me into something stronger than I had ever imagined possible. Beast Barracks, the intensive summer training program for new cadets, pushed every limit I thought I had. We woke at 05:30 hours to the sound of upperclassmen shouting commands. We learned to make our beds with hospital corners so tight you could bounce a quarter off them. We memorized the cadet prayer, the alma mater, and hundreds of other pieces of military knowledge while maintaining perfect posture and speaking only when spoken to. The physical demands were relentless. Daily fitness training, military drills, long marches with heavy packs. My body, which had been in good shape from high school track, discovered muscles I didn't know existed. My hands, once soft and manicured according to Patricia's standards, developed calluses from handling weapons and repelling equipment. But the mental challenges were even more intense. We studied engineering, mathematics, military history, and leadership theory. We learned to think strategically, to solve complex problems under pressure, to make decisions that could affect the lives of others. The academic standards were higher than anything I had experienced, and the consequences of failure were immediate and public. I excelled in ways that surprised even me. The spatial reasoning skills that Mrs. Henderson had noticed in 5th grade served me well in engineering courses. The discipline I had developed through years of secret preparation for West Point helped me adapt to military structure. Most importantly, the independence I had been forced to develop in my own family prepared me for the isolation of being away from everything familiar. During those first months, I wrote letters home every week. Long, detailed letters describing my classes, my training, my new friends. I wrote to my father about the engineering projects we were working on, thinking he might appreciate the technical challenges. I wrote to Patricia about the formal dinners and social protocols, hoping she might find some common ground there. I even wrote to Marcus, trying to be the big sister I had never really been allowed to be. The responses were few and far between. Patricia sent a brief note congratulating me on completing Beast Barracks, but it felt obligatory, like a thank you card written by social convention rather than genuine interest. My father sent a check for my birthday with a card that simply said, "Hope you're well, Dad." Marcus never wrote back at all. By my 2nd year, the letters from home had stopped entirely. I continued writing, but less frequently, and with diminishing hope that they would bridge the growing silence between us. I began to understand that my family had made their choice just as definitively as I had made mine. But West Point was teaching me that family could be more than blood relations. My roommate, Lisa Martinez from El Paso, became the sister I had always wanted. She was fierce and funny, brilliant in ways that had nothing to do with test scores, and loyal in a way that transcended the temporary nature of military assignments. We studied together, trained together, supported each other through the inevitable moments of doubt and exhaustion. Lisa came from a military family. Her father was a master sergeant in the Army, her mother a nurse, who had followed him from base to base around the world. When I told her about my family's reaction to my choice, she shook her head in disbelief. "They're idiots," she said, with characteristic bluntness. "Do they have any idea how hard it is to get into this place? Do they understand what you're going to be able to accomplish? They think I'm throwing my life away," I admitted. "No," Lisa said. "They think you're living a life they can't control." There's a difference. She was right. Of course, the more I succeeded at West Point, the more I realized that my father's anger had never been about my career choice itself. It had been about my refusal to let him and Patricia define the boundaries of my life. During my junior year, I was selected for a summer internship with the Army Corps of Engineers. I spent 10 weeks working on a dam renovation project in Tennessee, applying classroom engineering principles to real-world infrastructure challenges. It was exactly the kind of work my father did in the civilian world, but on a scale and with a purpose that dwarfed anything Williams Construction had ever undertaken. I called him from the construction site one evening, excited to share details about the project. The similarities to his work were too obvious to ignore, and I hoped that maybe, finally, he might see value in what I was doing. "Dad, it's Rebecca," I said when he answered the phone. "Oh, hello, Rebecca." His voice was polite, but distant, the tone he might use with a business acquaintance. "I wanted to tell you about the project I'm working on this summer. It's a dam renovation, and the engineering challenges are incredible. We're dealing with water pressure dynamics and structural integrity issues that reminded me of some of the problems you've solved on your hospital projects." There was a long pause. "That's nice, dear. I thought you might find it interesting. The scale is enormous. This dam provides power to 3 states, and the renovations we're doing will extend its operational life by 50 years. I'm sure it's very impressive." His tone was so carefully neutral that it felt like a slap. I tried once more. "Dad, I'm learning so much here. things that could be useful in civilian construction too. Maybe when I graduate, we could talk about ways to incorporate some of these techniques into Williams' construction projects. The silence stretched so long I wondered if the connection had been lost. Rebecca, he said finally, you made your choice 4 years ago. I've made mine. I think it's better if we don't pretend there's going to be some kind of reconciliation here. The line went dead. I stood in the Tennessee heat, holding the phone and feeling something inside me break and heal simultaneously. Break, because any lingering hope I had carried about eventual family acceptance finally died. Heal, because the uncertainty was over. I knew exactly where I stood, and I could stop wasting energy on relationships that would never be repaired. That night, I called Lisa instead. She was spending the summer at Fort Benning, going through airborne training. When I told her about the conversation with my father, she was quiet for a long moment. You know what this means, right? She said. That I'm officially an orphan? No, idiot. It means you're free. You don't have to carry their expectations anymore. You don't have to prove anything to them. You can just be excellent for your own reasons. She was right again. For the first time since leaving Richmond, I felt genuinely liberated from the weight of trying to win approval that would never come. I threw myself into my studies and training with renewed focus, not because I was trying to prove something to my family, but because I was building a life that belonged entirely to me. My senior year at West Point was transformative in ways I hadn't expected. I was selected as a company commander, responsible for leading 120 of my fellow cadets. I learned what it meant to make decisions that affected other people's lives, to balance competing demands, to earn respect through competence rather than birthright. I also met Captain James Morrison, a tactical officer who became my mentor and eventually helped shape my understanding of what military leadership really meant. He was a combat veteran who had served multiple deployments in the Middle East, and he had a way of cutting through the theoretical aspects of leadership training to focus on the practical realities of taking care of soldiers. Leadership isn't about being in charge, he told me during one of our weekly mentoring sessions. It's about being responsible. Responsible for your soldiers' training, their welfare, their families, responsible for accomplishing the mission while bringing everyone home safely. Under his guidance, I began to understand that military service was about more than personal achievement or career advancement. It was about being part of something larger than yourself, about accepting responsibility for others, about serving a cause that transcended individual ambition. Graduation day at West Point was everything my high school graduation had not been. Lisa's entire family came, along with the families of several other cadets I had grown close to over 4 years. They cheered when I crossed the stage, took pictures when I threw my cap in the air, celebrated with champagne and tears when I was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the United States Army. My own family was not there. I had sent them an invitation, but I hadn't expected a response. Still, as I stood with my new classmates, all of us in our dress blue uniforms with gold second lieutenant bars gleaming on our shoulders, I felt surrounded by love and support from the community I had chosen, and that had chosen me in return. Captain Morrison found me after the ceremony and shook my hand formally. Congratulations, Lieutenant Williams, he said. You're going to do great things in this army. Thank you, sir. For everything. He smiled. Just remember what we talked about. Take care of your soldiers and they'll take care of you. I carried those words with me as I began my first assignment at Fort Stewart, Georgia, leading a platoon of combat engineers. The soldiers under my command were older than me, more experienced in many ways, but they taught me what Captain Morrison had meant about mutual responsibility. I learned their names, their backgrounds, their families. I made sure they had the training and equipment they needed, and gradually, I earned their respect and their trust. My military career progressed steadily. Deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan, where I led construction projects that provided clean water and reliable power to communities that had been without both for decades. Promotions that came with increased responsibility and recognition. Advanced degrees in engineering and strategic studies. Command positions that required balancing increasingly complex demands. Through it all, I continued to write occasional letters home. Not seeking reconciliation anymore but maintaining a thread of connection that felt important even when it went unanswered. I sent wedding invitations when I married David Chen, Sarah's older brother, a fellow Army officer I met during a deployment. I sent birth announcements when our children were born. I sent Christmas cards with photos of our growing family. The silence from Richmond remained complete, but the family I had built in the Army, the network of relationships forged through shared service and mutual respect, provided everything I needed. I learned that love isn't diminished by being chosen rather than inherited. If anything, it's strengthened by being intentional. By the time I reached the rank of colonel, I had stopped expecting anything from my biological family. I had built a life of purpose and meaning, surrounded by people who valued me for who I was rather than who they wanted me to be. I thought the story was over. I thought the wounds had healed as much as they ever would. I had no idea that everything was about to change. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in October. I was in my office at the Pentagon, reviewing budget proposals for infrastructure projects across 3 different theaters of operation, when my aide knocked on the door and told me I had an urgent personal call. "Colonel Williams, this is Dr. Elizabeth Harper at VCU Medical Center in Richmond. I'm calling about your father, Thomas Williams." My heart clenched immediately. Despite everything that had passed between us, despite the years of silence, he was still my father. "What's happened?" "He suffered a massive heart attack 3 days ago. He's been in intensive care, but I'm afraid his condition is deteriorating rapidly. The family asked me to contact you." 3 days. He had been fighting for his life for 3 days and no one had thought to call me. Until now. "How bad is it?" "I'm sorry, Colonel Williams. You should come as soon as possible if you want to see him." I was on a plane to Richmond within 4 hours, my mind racing with questions I hadn't allowed myself to ask in years. What would I say to him? What would he say to me? After 2 decades of mutual silence, was there anything left to salvage from the wreckage of our relationship? David wanted to come with me, but I told him to stay with our children. This was something I needed to face alone. During the flight, I stared out the window at the landscape passing below, and tried to prepare myself for whatever I might find. The hospital smelled like disinfectant and fear. I found the intensive care unit and identified myself to the nurse, who looked at me with a mixture of surprise and sympathy. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but visiting hours ended an hour ago. Family members only." "I am family. I'm his daughter." She checked her chart, frowning slightly. "I have Mrs. Williams and her son Marcus listed as the primary contacts." "Are you sure you're on the authorized visitor list?" The words hit like ice water. Even here, even now, I have been excluded from my own family. "I'm Rebecca Williams Chen. Thomas Williams is my father." The nurse's expression softened with understanding. "Let me check with Mrs. Williams. She's in the family waiting room." I followed her down a corridor lined with generic artwork and motivational posters. Through the glass doors of the waiting room, I could see Patricia sitting in a vinyl chair, her hair perfectly styled despite the circumstances, her makeup flawless. Marcus stood next to her, talking quietly on his phone. He was 31 now, successful in his own right as the vice president of Williams Construction, but he still looked like the golden child receiving instructions from his mother. The nurse knocked gently and entered. I watched through the glass as she spoke to Patricia, saw my stepmother's face change from polite attention to something colder and more calculating. She shook her head firmly, gesturing with one manicured hand as if dismissing an unwelcome solicitor. The nurse returned to the hallway, her expression apologetic but firm. "I'm sorry, Colonel Williams. Mrs. Williams says that you're not listed as next of kin, and that your father specifically requested no contact with you during his treatment." The words were a punch to the solar plexus. "That's not possible. I'm his biological daughter." "I understand, ma'am, but I have to follow the family's wishes." "I'm truly sorry." I stood in that sterile hallway for a long moment, watching through the glass as Patricia and Marcus continued their vigil. Neither of them looked in my direction, neither of them acknowledged my presence, even though they had to know I was there. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Even facing his own mortality, my father had chosen to exclude me. Even now, Patricia was making sure the family narrative remained intact. Thomas Williams had one child, Marcus, and one wife, Patricia. The inconvenient daughter from his first marriage simply didn't exist. I left the hospital that night and checked into a hotel near the airport. I called David and told him what had happened, and he immediately offered to fly out and be with me. But I needed to think, needed to process what this final rejection meant, and how I wanted to respond to it. My father died 2 days later, while I was sitting in my hotel room reading incident reports from Afghanistan. The same nurse called to inform me, her voice gentle with practiced sympathy. "Colonel Williams, I wanted to let you know that your father passed away this morning, at 6:47 a.m. I'm very sorry for your loss. Thank you for calling. The family has asked me to inform you that the funeral arrangements are private. Family only." Of course they were. Even in death, I was to remain invisible, erased from the story of Thomas Williams's life as thoroughly as if I had never existed. I flew back to Washington that afternoon and threw myself into work. There would be no grieving process for me, no formal closure, no opportunity to say goodbye to the complicated man who had shaped so much of my early life. There would be only the familiar weight of exclusion and the growing certainty that some wounds never heal. But that wasn't the end of it. 3 weeks after the funeral, I received a call from a lawyer named Mitchell Brennan. He identified himself as the executor of my father's estate and asked if I could meet with him at his Richmond office to discuss some legal matters. "I don't understand," I told him. "I wasn't included in any of the funeral arrangements. I assumed I wasn't mentioned in his will either." "Actually, Colonel Williams, that's exactly what I need to discuss with you. There are some discrepancies that have come to light during the probate process." I drove back to Richmond the following week, curious despite myself. Brennan's office was in one of the old brick buildings downtown, the kind of place that specialized in family law and estate planning for Virginia's established families. He was older, maybe 70, with the patient demeanor of someone who had seen every possible family dysfunction in his 40 years of practice. "Colonel Williams, thank you for coming. I'll get straight to the point. Your father's will, the one that's been filed for probate, leaves everything to Patricia Williams and Marcus Williams. However, we've discovered that there was an earlier will, filed with a different attorney, that tells a very different story." He placed 2 documents on the desk between us. The will that Patricia filed was dated 18 months ago. But this other will, which we found in a safety deposit box that Mrs. Williams apparently didn't know about, was executed just 6 months ago. I leaned forward to examine the documents. The more recent will was in my father's handwriting, witnessed and notarized properly, and it left the majority of his estate to me. "I don't understand," I said, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. Why would he write a new will, leaving everything to me and then not tell anyone about it? Brennan's expression was carefully neutral. "That's not the only irregularity we've discovered. It appears that Mrs. Williams has been systematically transferring assets out of your father's accounts over the past 2 years. Significant amounts, real estate transactions, business investments, retirement fund withdrawals. All authorized with your father's signature." He placed another stack of papers in front of me. Bank statements, transfer documents, property deeds. "The problem is, according to the medical records we've subpoenaed, your father was suffering from early-stage dementia for the past 3 years. His mental capacity was severely compromised during the period when most of these transactions took place." The room seemed to tilt slightly. "Are you saying that Patricia took advantage of his condition to steal from him?" "I'm saying that there are serious questions about the validity of these financial transfers and about Mrs. Williams's role as his primary caregiver and financial power of attorney. The more recent will, the one that benefits you, was written during a period when his medical records show he was having a particularly lucid phase. It also includes a letter addressed to you specifically." He handed me an envelope with my name written in my father's familiar handwriting. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it and began to read. "Rebecca, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and the truth is finally coming out. I need you to know that I never stopped loving you, even when I was too proud and too stubborn to show it. Patricia has been controlling more and more of my life, including my finances and my medical care. I've tried to protect what's rightfully yours, but I'm not sure how much time I have left while I'm still thinking clearly. I know I failed you as a father. I know I let Patricia and Marcus convince me that your choice to serve was somehow a rejection of our family. I was wrong about that, and I was wrong about so many other things. You were the bravest of all of us, and I should have told you that years ago. The business, the properties, the investments, most of it should go to you. You're the one with the vision and the integrity to build something meaningful with it. Marcus is a good boy, but he's never had to work for anything. Patricia has made sure of that. I'm proud of what you've accomplished, Rebecca. I'm proud that you chose your own path and succeeded beyond anything I could have imagined. I'm sorry it took me so long to realize that your strength was something to celebrate, not something to fear. Please forgive a foolish, old man who loved you more than he knew how to show. Your father, Thomas Williams. I read the letter 3 times before I could speak. When I finally looked up, Brennan was watching me with the patient sympathy of someone who had delivered similar revelations many times before. There's more, he said gently. We've discovered that Mrs. Williams has been intercepting your correspondence for years. Letters, packages, invitations. She's been collecting them and hiding them from your father. We found boxes of them in her personal safe. The betrayal was so complete, so systematic, that it took my breath away. Every letter I had written, every attempt to maintain connection, every milestone I had shared. Patricia had made sure none of it reached him. She had orchestrated our estrangement with the precision of a military campaign. What happens now? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Now we fight, Brennan said. We challenge the fraudulent will. We recover the stolen assets, and we make sure your father's true wishes are honored. It won't be easy, and it won't be quick. Patricia Williams is going to fight this with everything she has. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my purse. For 23 years I had believed that my father had rejected me completely. Now I knew the truth. He had been fighting for me, even when I didn't know it, even when Patricia had made sure I couldn't know it. The war I thought was over was actually just beginning. But this time, I wasn't fighting alone. This time I had the truth on my side, and this time, I was going to win. The legal battle consumed the next 8 months of my life. Patricia Williams had underestimated many things about me over the years, but her biggest miscalculation was thinking that a career military officer wouldn't know how to wage a strategic campaign. I approached the fight for my father's estate with the same methodical precision I had used to plan military operations in 3 different theaters of war. Mitchell Brennan proved to be an invaluable ally. His quiet, grandfatherly demeanor concealed a razor-sharp legal mind and 40 years of experience with complex family disputes. Together, we built a case that was both emotionally devastating and legally airtight. The evidence was overwhelming once we knew where to look. Medical records showing my father's cognitive decline, bank statements revealing systematic transfers of funds to accounts Patricia controlled, a paper trail of intercepted correspondence that painted her as a manipulative predator who had isolated an elderly man from his daughter while systematically looting his assets. But Patricia fought back with all the resources my father's money could buy. She hired the most expensive law firm in Richmond and launched a counteroffensive that was both vicious and personal. Her lawyers painted me as a cold, calculating military officer who had abandoned her family decades ago and was now swooping in like a vulture to claim an inheritance she didn't deserve. They questioned my patriotism, suggesting that someone who had spent more time overseas than in Virginia couldn't possibly understand the values my father had held dear. They questioned my femininity, implying that a woman who chose military service over marriage and motherhood was somehow unnatural. They even questioned my mental stability, suggesting that the stress of combat had damaged my judgment and made me paranoid about family relationships. The depositions were brutal. Patricia's lawyer, a silver-haired shark named Harrison Caldwell, treated me like a hostile witness in a criminal trial. He questioned me about every deployment, every promotion, every decision I had made since leaving Richmond at 18. Colonel Williams, isn't it true that you chose your military career over maintaining a relationship with your family? No, that's not true. I made numerous attempts to maintain contact with my family. Those attempts were systematically intercepted and hidden from my father by your client. But you did choose to leave Virginia for New York, didn't you? You chose to pursue a career that would take you far from your family. I chose to serve my country. Yes. And in making that choice, didn't you effectively abandon your responsibilities to your family? I looked directly at him, drawing on 23 years of experience in remaining calm under pressure. No, Mr. Caldwell. I fulfilled my responsibilities to my country while attempting to maintain my relationship with my family. Your client made sure that was impossible. The most difficult moment came when they played a recorded statement Patricia had convinced my father to make during the early stages of his dementia. In it, he spoke about feeling abandoned by his daughter, about her choosing strangers over family, about his disappointment in the path she had chosen. Hearing his voice, even knowing that Patricia had manipulated him into making the statement, was like being stabbed in the chest. The words were his, even if the context had been manufactured. The pain was real, even if the circumstances were fraudulent. But we had weapons of our own. The handwritten letter my father had left me was devastating in its clarity and emotion. When Brennan read it aloud in court, I watched Patricia's face go pale. Marcus, sitting beside her, looked genuinely shocked, as if he were hearing about his stepmother's manipulation for the first time. We also had the testimony of Dr. Sarah Chen, my old friend Sarah, now a respected neurologist who had reviewed my father's medical records at my request. She testified that the cognitive testing showed clear signs of dementia during the period when most of the financial transfers had occurred, and that my father would have been particularly vulnerable to manipulation by someone he trusted. In my professional opinion, she said, her voice steady and authoritative, Mr. Williams was not mentally competent to make major financial decisions during the 18 months before his death. His condition would have made him highly susceptible to influence from someone in a caregiver role. The turning point came when we discovered that Patricia had been secretly recording my father's phone conversations during his final years. She had intended the recordings as evidence of his mental decline, presumably to support future claims about his incompetence, but when we obtained them through legal discovery, they told a very different story. In conversation after conversation, my father asked about me. He wondered why I never called anymore. He asked Patricia to help him find my phone number so he could reach out to me. He talked about missing me, about regretting the distance between us, about wanting to repair our relationship before it was too late. And in recording after recording, Patricia deflected, redirected, and outright lied. She told him I was too busy with my military career to call. She said I had expressed no interest in reconciling. She claimed I had forbidden contact, that I wanted nothing to do with the family. When those recordings were played in court, the effect was electric. The jury, 12 citizens of Richmond who had grown up respecting both military service and family values, heard the truth in my father's voice. They heard an elderly man asking for his daughter, and they heard the woman who was supposed to be caring for him systematically denying him that connection. Patricia's composure cracked for the first time during those recordings. I watched her hands tremble as she heard her own voice lying to the man she claimed to love, manipulating him with casual cruelty. But the final blow came from an unexpected source. Marcus himself. My half-brother had been quiet throughout most of the proceedings, following Patricia's lead and supporting her version of events. But as the evidence mounted, as the recordings played, as the true scope of her deception became clear, something in him shifted. During a break in the proceedings, he approached me in the courthouse hallway. We hadn't spoken directly since that dinner table conversation when I was 17. Rebecca, he said, his voice uncertain. I need to tell you something. I waited, studying his face. He looked older than his 31 years, worn down by months of legal proceedings and family upheaval. I didn't know, he said quietly. About the letters. About the phone calls. She told me you never tried to contact us. She said you had made it clear you wanted nothing to do with the family. And you believed her? He nodded, shame evident in his expression. I wanted to believe her. It was easier than questioning why my sister had disappeared from our lives. I was 11 when you left, Rebecca. I barely knew you, and what I did know came from Patricia. What are you saying, Marcus? I'm saying I want to testify. I want to tell the court what I remember from when I was younger, before Dad got sick. I want to tell them about the times he asked about you, about how Patricia always changed the subject. His testimony was devastating to Patricia's case. Marcus described finding birthday cards addressed to me that had never been sent. He talked about overhearing phone conversations where my father wondered aloud why I never called. He testified about Patricia's systematic campaign to erase me from family conversations and family memories. Most damaging of all, he revealed that Patricia had been forging my father's signature on financial documents for at least 2 years before his death. Marcus had discovered this by accident when he noticed discrepancies in the construction company's accounts, but Patricia had convinced him to keep quiet about it. She said it was for his own protection. Marcus testified, his voice barely audible. She said he wasn't capable of managing the finances anymore, and that she was just taking care of things until he recovered. But he never recovered, did he? Brennan asked gently. No, he never recovered. When the jury returned their verdict, it was swift and decisive. They found in my favor on every count. Patricia was ordered to return all assets she had fraudulently transferred, plus interest and penalties. She was also required to pay restitution for the emotional distress caused by her interference with family relationships. More importantly, they validated my father's final will, the one that expressed his true wishes about his estate and his feelings about his daughter. But the moment that mattered most to me came after the verdict. As we were leaving the courthouse, a small crowd had gathered outside. Reporters, curious onlookers, members of the community who had followed the case. Among them was an unexpected group, 12 members of the Army Honor Guard, led by Chaplain Michael Torres from Fort Lee. They were there, they explained, to honor both my father's memory and my service to the country. As Patricia and Marcus emerged from the courthouse, the honor guard snapped to attention. Chaplain Torres stepped forward and spoke in a voice that carried across the courthouse steps. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today to honor the memory of Thomas Williams, a veteran of the Virginia National Guard, and a man who built much of the infrastructure that serves this community. We are also here to honor his daughter, Brigadier General Rebecca Williams, whose service to this nation has included 3 combat deployments and leadership of the Army Corps of Engineers' largest construction projects worldwide. The crowd fell silent. Patricia stopped walking, her face frozen in shock. Marcus stood beside her, his expression unreadable. The chaplain continued. General Williams has spent 23 years serving her country with the same dedication to building and protecting that her father demonstrated in his civilian career. She has led construction projects that brought clean water to Afghan villages, rebuilt schools in Iraq, and strengthened infrastructure throughout the United States. He paused, his eyes finding mine in the crowd. Thomas Williams raised a daughter who chose to serve something larger than herself. That choice brought honor to his name and to his legacy. Today, justice has been served, and truth has been revealed. The 12 Honor Guard members rendered a perfect salute. I returned it, my hand steady despite the emotions coursing through me. In that moment, standing on the courthouse steps in the city where I was born, I felt something I hadn't experienced since childhood. The weight of my father's approval. Not the approval I had spent decades trying to earn, but the approval he had been trying to give me all along. Patricia walked past without making eye contact, her shoulders rigid with defeat and humiliation. But Marcus stopped. He looked at me for a long moment, then stepped forward and offered his hand. I'm sorry, Rebecca, he said quietly. I'm sorry for all of it. I shook his hand, feeling the possibility of a relationship we had never been allowed to have. We both lost him. I said, but maybe we don't have to lose each other. He nodded, tears in his eyes, and for the first time in over 2 decades, I felt like I might actually have a brother. The war was over. Truth had won. And finally, I could begin to heal. 6 months after the courthouse steps, I found myself standing in a very different place, but with the same sense of coming full circle. The construction site stretched before me in the early morning light, but this wasn't one of my father's projects. This was mine. The Williams Veterans Center was rising from the ground like a promise kept, 3 stories of steel and glass and brick, designed to house job training programs, mental health services, and transitional housing for veterans returning to civilian life. It would serve the same community my father had built for decades, but with a mission that bridged the gap between his world and mine. I walked through the construction site with the same careful attention to detail he had taught me as a child, checking progress reports and discussing structural challenges with the foreman. But now I wore a hard hat that bore my own name and rank, and the workers called me General Williams with respect. I had earned rather than inherited. The funding had come from multiple sources. Part of my father's estate, restored to me through the legal victory, provided the foundation. Federal grants for veteran services added substantial support, but the largest single contribution came from an unexpected source. Marcus had donated his inheritance from Patricia's settlement, money she had been forced to return as part of the court judgment. "I don't deserve it," he had told me during one of our monthly dinners, a new tradition we had established as we worked to build the relationship we should have had all along. "She stole it from Dad, and indirectly from you. It feels wrong to keep it." Our relationship was still fragile, still developing, but it was real in a way it had never been when we were children. He was learning to see me as the sister he had never been allowed to know, and I was learning to forgive the boy who had been manipulated as thoroughly as our father had been. The Veterans Center project gave us common ground. Marcus brought his expertise in construction management and local business relationships. I brought military connections and experience with federal contracting. Together, we were building something that honored our father's memory while serving a cause we both believed in. Working alongside Marcus had taught me things about my father that I had never known. Stories about his service in the National Guard, his quiet philanthropy in the community, his struggles with Patricia's increasing control over his life and business decisions. I learned that my father had established a scholarship fund for children of military families years before his death, something Patricia had never mentioned during our legal proceedings. "He talked about you more than she let on," Marcus told me one evening as we reviewed architectural plans in his office. Even when she changed the subject, even when she redirected the conversation, I could see it in his face. "He missed you." Those conversations helped heal wounds I didn't even know were still bleeding. The knowledge that my father had thought of me, had missed me, had been proud of me in ways he couldn't express, made the years of silence feel less like rejection and more like tragedy. We had both been victims of Patricia's manipulation, separated by lies when we should have been celebrating shared values and mutual respect. The construction progressed steadily through the spring and into summer. Each week brought visible progress: foundations poured, steel erected, walls rising. But the most meaningful developments were happening in smaller ways, in quiet moments, that reminded me why this project mattered. Veterans began stopping by the site, even before construction was complete. Word had spread through informal networks about what we were building, and men and women who had served began appearing at the fence line, watching the progress with interest and hope. Some were homeless, some were unemployed, some were struggling with injuries or trauma that made civilian life difficult. I made it a point to talk with each of them, to learn their stories and understand their needs. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, who had lost his leg to an IED in Afghanistan and was having trouble finding work. Specialist Thompson, a young woman whose PTSD made it hard for her to sleep indoors. Staff Sergeant Martinez, who had excellent technical skills but no college degree, and couldn't find employers willing to give him a chance. Each conversation reminded me that this wasn't just about honoring my father's memory or finding personal closure. This was about serving people who had sacrificed for their country and deserved support as they transitioned back to civilian life. The grand opening ceremony took place on a crisp October morning, exactly 1 year after my father's death. We had planned it as a simple ribbon cutting with local officials and veterans organizations, but the event grew beyond our expectations. Governor Richardson attended, along with several state legislators and military officials. The Army Chief of Engineers sent a representative. Local businesses donated food and services for the celebration. But the most important guests were the veterans themselves, dozens of men and women who had served in conflicts from Vietnam to Afghanistan. As I stood at the podium to address the crowd, I looked out at faces that reflected decades of service and sacrifice. In the front row, Marcus sat with his wife and children, the nephew and niece I was finally getting to know. David stood with our own children, wearing his dress uniform and the proud expression of a husband who understood the significance of this moment. My father, Thomas Williams, believed that the most important thing you could do with your life was to build something lasting, I began. Something that would make your community stronger, that would serve others, that would outlast your own time on Earth. I paused, looking toward the building that bore his name alongside mine. For 30 years, he built infrastructure that serves this community. Schools where children learn, hospitals where families heal, housing where people build their lives. Today, we open a facility that continues that tradition of service, but with a focus on the men and women who have served our nation in uniform. The applause was warm and genuine, but I wasn't finished. I spent 23 years believing that my father disapproved of my choice to serve in the military. I learned too late that he was actually proud of that choice, proud of the path I had taken, proud of the service I was giving to something larger than myself. This center exists because he taught me that building something meaningful requires both vision and hard work. It exists because the military taught me that service to others is the highest calling any of us can answer. I looked directly at the veterans in the audience. To everyone who served, everyone who sacrificed, everyone who answered the call to defend our country, this is your place. This is where your experience and your skills and your dedication will be recognized and valued. This is where we will help you build the next chapter of your lives. The ribbon cutting was followed by tours of the facility. The Job Training Center, with its modern equipment and computer labs. The counseling offices are designed to provide a comfortable, non-clinical environment for mental health services. The transitional housing units that would allow veterans to live with dignity while they got back on their feet. But the moment that meant the most to me came later in the afternoon, when the crowds had thinned and the formal ceremonies were over. I was standing in the main lobby reviewing the day's events with Marcus, when an elderly man in a worn Vietnam veteran cap approached us. "General Williams," he said, his voice gravelly but respectful. "I wanted to thank you for this. My grandson just got back from his second deployment in Afghanistan. He's having a hard time adjusting, having trouble finding work. This could make all the difference for him." I shook his hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of decades of hard work. "That's exactly why we built it," I said. "Your grandson served his country. Now it's our turn to serve him." As the sun set over Richmond that evening, I walked through the completed facility one more time. The lobbies and offices were quiet now, but in a few weeks they would be filled with activity. Classes and counseling sessions and job interviews, and all the messy, hopeful work of helping people rebuild their lives. I found myself in the memorial room we had created to honor local veterans who had died in service. My father's name was on the wall, along with dozens of others from the Richmond area who had answered the call to serve. Below his name was a simple inscription: Thomas Williams, Virginia National Guard. Builder, father, patriot. Standing there in the quiet room, surrounded by the names of those who had served, I felt something I hadn't experienced since childhood. Complete peace with who I was and where I had come from. The angry, hurt young woman who had left Richmond 23 years ago was gone, replaced by someone who understood that healing doesn't come from winning battles, but from choosing to build something better from the wreckage of what was broken. My phone buzzed with a text message from David. "The kids are asking when you're coming home. Dinner's ready when you are." Home. The word carries different meanings now. Richmond would always be where I came from, but home was wherever my chosen family was waiting. Home was the life I had built through service and sacrifice and the daily choice to keep moving forward. I turned off the lights in the memorial room and locked the building for the night. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Veterans would start arriving, looking for help and hope and a second chance. The staff we had hired, many of them veterans themselves, would begin the patient work of rebuilding lives one person at a time. It wasn't the life my father had envisioned for me when I was 8 years old and carrying a clipboard around his construction sites, but it was a life that honored everything he had tried to teach me about building something meaningful, something lasting, something that made the world a little better than you found it. As I drove through the familiar streets of Richmond toward the airport, I thought about the girl who had left this city with nothing but determination and a suitcase full of dreams. She had built a life of service, had earned respect through competence rather than inheritance, had created a family based on love and choice rather than blood and obligation. Most importantly, she had learned that forgiveness isn't about forgetting the past or excusing the people who hurt you. Forgiveness is about refusing to let their failures define your future. It's about choosing to build something beautiful from the broken pieces they left behind. The plane lifted off into the evening sky, carrying me back to Washington and the life I had chosen. But part of me would always remain in Richmond now, in the building that bore my father's name and mine, in the work that would continue long after I was gone. I had finally built something lasting. Something he would have been proud of. Something that proved the little girl with the pink hard hat had been an engineer all along. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.